Okay, let's move on to our final speaker, Chuck Naw from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, co-leader and co-author of the effort that Dr. Austin mentioned this morning, the so-called ROI initiative led by NIST and the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House to consider what improvements are further needed in both federal agencies and universities and nonprofits technology transfer processes. It does address Marchant, but a lot of other subjects, including, importantly, the assumption by NIST of responsibility for the iEdison database, which we've had some discussion of earlier. So, Chuck, would you like to give us an overview of that report? And I don't think you called them recommendations, but you can explain.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you to the National Academies for this opportunity to talk. This is a distinguished panel, and they have all actually been integral to my development in tech transfer in the career. So I'm a little starstruck right now. So I'm going to take Jay's precedent and stay seated, just because maybe I'm too weak-kneed to stand. Star power. Anyways, so it is my pleasure to be one of the co-authors of the Return on Investment Initiative's Green Paper. So the purview of this endeavor was to try to figure out ways to improve the return on the federal government's $150 billion annual investment in R&D, primarily from the perspective of the transfer of innovations and assets that are developed from the R&D investment as it moves from the laboratory to the marketplace. A year ago in April, we kicked off an event. It was the Unleashing American Innovation Forum. And it was in conjunction with the Office of Management and Budget, because the NIST Return on Investment Initiative is an important feeder of ideas and solutions into the President's Management Agenda's cross-agency priority goal in lab to market. So we're one of the 14 big cross-agency endeavors to improve government function. So we went through a very long and transparent process of getting any feedback from stakeholders through a RFI, request for information, through public forums. Our leader, Dr. Walter Copan, went to many different events and spoke about the return on investment. But we wanted to really focus on ideas, challenges, things that the government is doing well, to feed ideas and inspire solutions that would decrease regulatory impediments or administrative issues that are preventing the federal laboratories or universities, contractors from getting the most out of the assets that they develop using federal funding for R&D, to develop a more entrepreneurial workforce, to engage more fully with the private sector's investors or R&D experts, to develop more innovative tools for supporting technology transfer, and also to understand the global trends and benchmarks, because we're competing in a increasingly competitive global landscape, and we recognize that since 1980, our assessment of our output, our assessment of our tech transfer successes are still kind of stuck behind. We're still looking at impact rather than doing much more narrative analyses like what Ashley presented. So in conducting these outreach to stakeholders, we've come out with the Green Paper, which summarizes 15 findings. They're not solutions, they're not proposed actions that we're taking. These are findings, the feedback that we were given as we talk to stakeholders. And we've actually organized them so that they correspond with different strategies as part of the cross-agency priority goal. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to go through some of these as they pertain to tech transfer, and I think it's quite applicable to the conversation that we're having about the impact of NIH funding and the development of drugs, as all three of the speakers on this panel have talked about Marchant. That'll be the first one that I'll hit. We are taking very seriously what stakeholders are saying about the lack of clarity when it comes to when Marchant might actually be applied, right? We know that it has never been exercised. However, the threat of it being exercised is still enough that it has often been said it has a cooling effect in the licensing negotiation parts of conversations. And so we're actually taking a much more definitional look at this, because we're understanding that the reasonable terms that was mentioned by Jay, that was reasonable terms that go to the conversation of the license from the contractor to the licensee. Those were the reasonable terms, not reasonable terms as made available to the consumer. Now, this is just what our take is on the finding that we received, but there are other aspects of the definitions in the law that we want to take a look at, because NIST has the ability to promulgate regulations in order to define and implement BIDOL. And so we're going to take that quite seriously as we work on another iteration of BIDOL regulations. Additionally, the government use license that's in BIDOL, stakeholders have stated that is confusing. It's ill-defined. What is the extent of the government use license? Can the government use this as a way to compete against a licensee on a technology? We want to make it clear that government use license is for internal use, and it is not intended to be a price competitive measure. We want to bring increased clarity to stakeholders about the preference for U.S. manufacturing. So, under BIDOL, licensees must make a commitment to manufacture substantially in the United States for exclusive licenses. Of course, they can go to funding agencies and ask for a waiver. And that waiver process has caused some consternation. Different agencies do different things. And so there is an interest from stakeholders to provide more clarity in that. We're also going for a big play. We're asking for federal employees to be able to exert copyright on software that's authored by federal employees. This would be a big change. The U.S. Copyright Office personnel have told us that it would be quite an exclusion from the general prohibition of government works being copyrightable. However, stakeholders have indicated that there have been substantial challenges in commercializing software solutions that have been developed with federal employees who are authors of that code. And we think that in the 21st century economy that we're playing in the digital field, we do need to be able to compete and allow our investigators to fully participate in the software commercialization world. Moving on to increasing engagement with private sector, technology development experts, and investors. There are several partnership mechanisms like the CRADA that was talked about by Dr. Austin, but some agencies have specific authorities that they can use. Space Act agreement, agreements to commercialize technologies that other agencies would like to be able to utilize. And so there are conversations about utilizing some additional authorities that might be granted with an amendment to the Stevenson-Wilder Act to push forward some ideas that will allow all agencies to use such agreements. Additionally, stakeholders were incredibly supportive of programs like I-Corps and other ways for the government and universities to interact and engage with small businesses, with entrepreneurs. And we want to be able to explore and foster and show our support for those kinds of technology commercialization activities. There is a a premium right now placed by the administration on building a more entrepreneurial R&D workforce. This does not mean that we want our federal employees to leave the federal sector to go start up a bunch of companies, but rather it's more of changing the mindset of having basic or applied researchers understand that they will need to engage with industry, that there should be a greater desire to be able to speak the same language, because the action of basic to applied research, there is not a clear line that demarcates that. There's a blending of those worlds, and we feel that there would be a greater return on investment if we got our workforce to be more friendly to entrepreneurial work. And so there are technology entrepreneurship programs that we want to show our support for, but additionally, we want to push forward some greater uniformity when it comes to managing conflicts of interest. We've heard a lot from university stakeholders as well that the federal government ought to have some opining about different uniformity efforts to make conflict of interest more manageable. The fourth strategy is around innovative tools and services. This is something very near and dear to my heart. We are going to follow the 2016 NAS report suggestion that the Department of Commerce take over iEdison function from the National Institutes of Health. iEdison was originally developed by the NIH, and they have done a wonderful job of creating an interagency reporting system that allows external grantees to report their inventions and comply with Bayh-Dole regulations. Since NIST is the regulatory body for Bayh-Dole, we'll bring it in-house. We'll make it a more uniform system. And our goal is to have every agency use iEdison. It's an ambitious goal. We'll see how well we do. But also, we want to push that forward to internal, right? So I heard the researchers talking about the fact that we need, you want more data. Well, it would be nice if we could see what we have in-house across all of the federal sectors, right? So each agency uses their own systems, and there is no crosstalk. How wonderful would it be if we had an internal system like an iEdison so that we can see what's happening within the government's R&D system? And finally, we have a lot of different initiatives that are moving forward in trying to benchmark and understand the return on investment that is ongoing right now, right? So to fully understand the effectiveness of federal tech transfer and also to increase our ability to understand that. So that's an overview of the green paper. You can find it, Google NIST ROI, and it'll be the first hit, I promise. So yeah, thank you.
Great. Anyone on the panel have questions of Chuck?
I very much admire your artful presentation and a delightful report. I will strenuously disagree with one point that you made of substance. And the point is that Marchant Rights only apply. This is the position of NIST, Autumn, and various actors on one side of the debate, is that Marchant Rights only apply to the terms of the license between the government contractor and the licensee. So, for example, Georgetown University and Pfizer. Okay, now, I wrote a CS report that Steve mentioned, and I had heard of that argument, and I thought it was so ludicrous I didn't even put it in the report. I didn't think it would have any kind of traction. The Marchant Rights provision, when it wants to, and see, that's why I bring the statute up. I saw you looking at it too, and I encourage you to look at this part. Says what it wants to. It speaks to the contractor, assignee, or their licensees. It speaks to them specifically. But when it speaks to the requirement of practical application, it says that the benefits of the invention available to the public on reasonable terms. And I think you would say contractor, assignee, or licensees. I don't think the public is Pfizer. What's a public of one? I don't understand that interpretation of public, and I don't know if you're prepared or care to talk any more about that. But to me, that's a bit too much legislative skullduggery, and I don't think that's what Congress intended. Thank you.
I will respond very briefly to that because there are some elements of it, as you may be aware, I probably don't want to step into. But We have tried to go into the legislative history to try to figure out the intent. And the best that we could come up with was taking Senator Bay's words. I think it was a 2002 testimony that he gave. Well, you can respond to that, but that's where we are right now as far as how we're interpreting what the intention was, and also trying to understand in the four cases, four circumstances when we would actually say this is when Marchant ought to apply, trying to just make sense of where those two areas meet.
I'll just say very quickly, a statement made 22 years later may not accurately capture legislative intent, especially when you're working as a Viagra pitchman for Pfizer at the time. Those of you of a certain age will remember the television adverts. I've said enough. Thank you.
So
That was Bob Dole, not Birch Bayh.
Bayh was a lobbyist then and did some work for pharma.
So can I jump in?
Sure.
Jay, and I don't know if you're a lawyer, Chuck, but Jay is fair game for this question because I know he knows some administrative law as well. Do you think that the terms of Bayh-Dole dictate that reasonable terms include pricing? In other words, does the agency have any discretion to make what it considers a reasonable interpretation under Chevron Step 2?
Or do you mind weighing in as well?
I can weigh in, but first I want Jay to weigh in.
Absolutely, yes. It's the plain meaning of the statute, and on Step 1, and if there's any ambiguity, this is a reasonable interpretation.
I would say that it's a Step 2 question. Now, the Supreme Court may just overturn Chevron at some point before any of this reaches the court, so we don't know. But I do think that that's part of the problem, that Congress was very ambiguous, and I think the plain meaning is not there.
Go ahead. So if you don't trust Birch Bayh or Bob Dole, we do have access to Joe Allen, who was the chief staffer on the Senate Judiciary Committee when Bayh-Dole was drafted. And Joe will tell you that the Marchant provision, which was a continuation, and I would disagree with you, of the Kennedy administration, I was told it was the Truman administration, wanting to ensure that the fruits of federally funded research reach the people, that the Marchant provision was intended because in 1980, they perceived universities as inexperienced licensors, and they were worried that big companies could see something disruptive coming, license it and spike it to protect their existing investment and business. And this was the keep everybody honest provision that was included. Since then, universities have become very sophisticated licensors. We have due diligence provisions, steps that exclusive licensees have to reach by defined time periods to ensure that the technology is progressing to the market. Failure to meet is grounds for termination for material breach, return of the technology, and generally, if they've negotiated well, of all the associated data. And that's why, as you correctly observe, it's never been proposed once as a remedy for failure to develop.